Hi, Teresa here for Blind Spots again. So in the context of the upcoming elections in Hungary, if you only look at Hungary through the lens of Orbán versus Magyar, you miss the bigger picture. Because this election is not just about one government rising or falling. It's about, as we've discussed in previous videos, what kind of Europe survives the decade ahead, and about who wants to weaken it. That is why Hungary matters far beyond Hungary. Viktor Orbán is not just another conservative European leader. He has spent years turning Hungary into something much more useful than that. An EU and NATO member state that can obstruct, dilute, delay, and rhetorically reframe Western consensus from inside the room. That is what makes him valuable. Not because Hungary is the biggest country in Europe, not because Orbán commands some giant economy or military force, but because a spoiler inside the structure can sometimes be more useful than an enemy outside it. For Russia, Orbán's value is pretty obvious. He's been one of Moscow's most useful partners inside the European Union. Not in the sense of a puppet on a string, but in the much more practical sense of a leader who slows sanctions, complicates support for Ukraine, preserves Russian energy ties, and helps fracture the idea of a united European front. All of that is strategic gold for the Kremlin, because Russia doesn't need to conquer Europe to weaken it. As we've discussed previously in another video, it only needs Europe to stay divided, suspicious, and unable to act cohesively when it matters. But Russia is not the only outside force that sees value in Orbán. That is where JD Vance's visit to Budapest becomes so revealing. A sitting US vice president travelled to Hungary days before the election, stood beside Orbán, urged Hungarians to support him, praised him as a defender of Western civilization, and accused the European Union of interfering in Hungary's democracy. That was extraordinary. Not because politicians never meddle in narratives abroad, not because the US never meddles in narratives abroad, it does, but because this was not subtle. It was a direct show of support for one side in another country's election by the Vice President of the United States, and that forces a deeper question. Why would Washington, or more precisely, why would the Trump-Vance faction in Washington care this much about keeping Orbán in power? The answer is not that Orbán and Trumpism are identical. They're not. The answer is perhaps that Orbán has become a model. To the MAGA right, he represents a version of conservative power that is no longer content merely to argue within liberal democracy, but wants to reshape the terms and the rules of the game itself. A state that is nationalist, anti-migration, culturally combative, suspicious of liberal institutions, and hostile to supranational constraint. And also, it's willing to use the machinery of government to entrench its worldview while keeping elections in place. That is the case of Hungary. That is what parts of the American right admire about Hungary and about Orbán's system or model. Not just his policies, his method. And this is where the word illiberal actually matters. Because liberal democracy is not just about voting. It's about constraints on power. It's about having independent institutions. It's about pluralism. It's about protecting dissent, that you can have dissent. It's about checks and balances on power. The idea that winning an election doesn't entitle you to own the state. Illiberal politics, on the other hand, keeps the outer shell, elections, parliaments, constitutions, but weakens the liberal substance underneath. It narrows pluralism, politicizes institutions, and makes dissent less safe or less equal, and also frames restraint itself as sabotage by the common enemy, the common traitors, or foreign meddlers. That is why Orbán matters so much to both Russia and MAGA. For Russia, he weakens liberal Europe geopolitically. For MAGA, he weakens liberal Europe ideologically. Those aren't the same, obviously, but they overlap enough to make the same man useful to both. So where does Péter Magyar fit into this? And this is perhaps where it gets a bit more hazy, because Magyar is not some revolutionary outsider. He came out of the Fidesz world. He was part of that system. He's not running as some radical liberal savior who wants to turn Hungary into a different country overnight. In fact, one reason he's so interesting is that he is much more limited than that. He has supported strong ties with the EU and NATO, and criticised Orbán's closeness to Moscow, and has argued that Hungary needs to repair relations with Brussels. But at the same time, he has also kept a tougher line on migration and is not presenting himself as some full-spectrum liberal transformation. And that is exactly why he's dangerous to Orbán's outside backers, because he doesn't need to transform Hungary completely to change the things that matter most to them, to Russia, to the US. If Magyar won, Hungary would likely become less useful as a Russian spoiler inside the EU. Hungary, under Magyar, would likely become less willing to play permanent trench warfare with Brussels. Hungary would likely, under Magyar, try to repair relations with the EU in order to unlock money, improve credibility, and reduce the cost of Orbán's long conflict with European institutions. And his victory and his election would almost certainly weaken the symbolic idea that Orbánism is the inevitable future of Europe, and that matters more than it seems. Because Orbán is not just a leader, he's a proof of concept. He's used by others, from parts of the European far right to the MAGA world, as evidence that you can govern in an openly anti-liberal, anti-Brussels, anti-migrant way and still dominate politics for years. If he loses, that myth takes a hit. Not a fatal hit, but a real one. And this is also why the reaction to Vance's Budapest trip was so revealing. Europe's institutional response was cautious, as usual, diplomatic, and frankly a bit bloodless, even though the event itself was extraordinary and unprecedented. That matters because it shows the asymmetry in this struggle. The American illiberal right can swagger into the theatre and frame itself as defending sovereignty while openly backing one side in a supposedly democratic election. The EU, by contrast, is forced to respond in almost procedural language, because if it becomes too dramatic, it only feeds Orbán's narrative that Brussels is trying to control Hungary. And Orbán knows that. So one side, and so does the US, so one side gets to behave like a movement, and the other is stuck sounding like a legal department. There's another layer to this too. A lot of the coverage still talks as if the main drama is Russian interference. And yes, Russian influence matters. And influence is more important word than interference. But what Vance's visit exposed is something broader and more uncomfortable, that some of the pressure on liberal Europe now comes not only from Moscow, but from inside the American right itself. And that is a serious shift, because for decades, the United States presented itself, at least rhetorically, as the guarantor of the liberal Western model. Now, a powerful faction within US politics openly admires leaders who chip away at that model from within. And that means Hungary is not just a Hungarian story. It's a warning light, blipping. It's a small country, yes, but it's a very revealing one. Because in Hungary, you can see, in concentrated form, a struggle that is becoming now much wider between liberal and illiberal visions of democracy, between Europe as a rules-based political project and Europe as a looser arena of nationalist states, or of between pluralism and the politics of civilizational siege, between institutions that restrain power and movements that want to capture power. Orbán sits right at that crossroads, and that is why Moscow and MAGA care so much about the result of these elections. Magyar, for all his limits, threatens that convenient arrangement, not because he's a radical, but because he could realign Hungary just enough to make it less useful to both camps. Less useful to Russia as a blocker inside Europe, less useful to MAGA as an illiberal success story. Less useful to everyone who benefits when the European project looks weak, divided, decadent, and doomed. And that is the real significance of this election in Hungary. Not whether Hungary suddenly becomes paradise under a new leader, not whether one vote solves the country's deeper problems, but whether one of the most important internal pressure points against liberal Europe remains in place. That's why this matters, and that's why Orbán's allies, both foreign and domestic, have fought so hard to keep him where he is.